program is going to be about the Dallas Gay Alliance, an alliance of gay people who were instrumental in the early 1980s through the 90s and today, the Dallas Gay and Lesbian Alliance, in working through a crisis, and we'll be leading up to a discussion about this crisis. In our conversation today, we're beginning, and we thank Wikipedia for the terrific opportunity to quote some of their information. We'll begin our subject matter today with the idea of genocide and definitions of genocide. I'll read from this text. Genocide. This is a list of scholarly and international legal definitions of genocide, a word coined with genos, birth, kind, race, and an English suffix, side, by Raphael Lemkin in 1944. The precise etymology of the word, however, is a compound of two ancient Greek words. This Greek I can't pronounce, and birth, genus, and kind, and the word, another Greek word I can't produce, murder, kill, massacre. While these are various definitions of the term, almost all international bodies of law officially educate the crime of genocide pursuant to the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, CPPCG. This is a convention. This is important. This and other definitions are genocide scholars who have an intent to destroy as a requirement for any act to be labeled genocide. There is also growing agreement on the inclusion of the physical destruction criteria. Writing in 1998, Kurt Johansson and Karen Björnsson stated that the CPPCG was a legal instrument resulting from a diplomatic compromise. As such, the wording of the treaty is not intended to be definition suitable as a research tool. And although it is used for the purpose, as it has an international legal credibility as others lack, other definitions also have been postulated. Here's the definition, beginning in the date 1944, Raphael Lemkin, Jewish-Polish jurist, came up. By genocide we mean the destruction of an ethnic group. Generally speaking, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accomplished by mass killings of all members of a nation. It is intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. The count of three, the indictment of the 24 Nazi leaders at the Nuremberg trials in 1945. They, the defendants, conducted deliberate and systematic genocide, the extermination of racial and national groups against the civilian populations of certain occupied territories in order to destroy particular races and classes of people, and national, racial, or religious groups, particularly Jews, Poles, Gypsies, and others. The definition of genocide continues. The crime of genocide should be recognized therein as a conspiracy to exterminate national, religious, or racial groups. In 1946, United Nations Assembly Resolution 96, genocide is a denial of the right of existence of entire human groups, as homicide is the denial of the right to live of individual human beings. Such denial of the right of existence shocks the conscience of mankind. In 1948, any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in the whole or in part, a national, ethical, racial, or religious group. As such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life. This is important. conditions of life, calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly restricting children of the group to another group. What we're seeing here is the building of a definition. It's important, perhaps, those of you who are kind enough to join us here at Cambridge Community Television, it's important that we recognize the building of a definition, because we will be looking to place this definition as a criteria for political acts. A further definition: genocide is the deliberate destruction of physical life of individual human beings by reason of their membership of any human collectivity as such. Genocide, in 1975, the Armenian sociologist. Genocide is a successful attempt by a dominant group vested with formal authority and with preponderant access to the overall resources of power to reduce by coercion or legal violence the number of a minority group whose ultimate extermination is held deliberate and useful, and whose respective vulnerability is a major factor contributing to the decision of genocide. And genocide in 1976 is a structural and systematic destruction of innocent people by a state bureaucratic apparatus. Genocide represents a systematic effort over time to liquidate a national population, usually a minority, functions as a fundamental political policy to assure conformity and participation of its citizenry. State power and mass murder, genocide. Leo Cooper goes forward in 1981. Jack Newson Porter, a Ukrainian-American sociologist, in 1982. Yehuda Bauer, Israel historian and Holocaust scholar. We'll look at this one by Yehuda Bauer. Genocide is the planned destruction since the mid-19th century of a racial, national, ethnic group as such by the following means: selective mass murder, elimination of national culture and religious life, destruction of national economic life, biological dissemination through the kidnapping of children, etc. Tony Barta, historian, Isidore Walliman and Michael Dobkovsky, Michael Huderbach, 1988, Helen Fine, sociologist, Barbara Huff and Ted Gurr, professors of political science. This may be important. The promotion and execution of policies by a state or its agents with the result in deaths of a substantial portion of a group, when the victimized groups are defined primarily in terms of their communal characteristics, ethnically, religiously, or nationally. And Frank Chalk and Kurt Johansen, genocide is a form of one-sided mass killing in which a state or other authority intends to destroy a group as that group and membership in it are defined by the perpetrator. This is an important definition by Kurt Chalk and Frank Chalk and Kurt Johansen. In short, given the problems which arise from restrictions, we define genocide as the destruction of a group by purposeful action. This allows a role of international action to be explored, different subtypes of genocide to be compared, and the impact of different factors on genocide to be examined empirically. Helen Fine, genocide is sustained purposeful action by a perpetrator to physically destroy or collectively, directly or indirectly, through interdiction of a biological or social reproduction of group members, sustained regardless of the surrender or lack of threat offered by the victim. Genocide, 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 genocide. Different directions and definitions of genocide. Interesting is genocide is an attempt to destroy any recognized stable and permanent group. We have John Cox, historian, as late as 2016. The definition: genocide is the attempt to destroy any recognized stable and permanent group as it is defined by the perpetrator. It is concealed effort to eliminate its individual members and to destroy the group's ability to maintain its social and cultural cohesion and thus its existence as a group. The perpetrator's genocide goal, i.e. its intent, which is central to the 1948 definition, but is often analyzed too legalistically and narrowly, can be uncovered by examining policies, actions, and outcome. Thank you for joining us here in our examination of the term genocide and how it is possible under the definition of 2016 to apply what the Congress of the United States is intending to do with its health care measures to be labeled a genocide. In today's program, we will be looking forward to the various aspects historically of how genocide has come about in the United States, the times those who were attacked and genocidally exterminated, with the idea of showing beyond any question of a doubt that in the history of the United States, genocides have come about numerous times, and all of the facts and groups that we will be mentioning today meet the criteria of the genocides we have just examined. Let's get a look. The first definition we have is Indian slaves and the mass murder, the hidden history. Indian slaves and mass murder. The New York Review of Books, we thank the New York Review of Books for this. This is the genocide, this is murder of a woman, probably in India. Woman being weighed, Baraka, from unknown sources, rediscovering the photographs. The European market in African slaves, which opened with the cargo of Mauritanian blacks unloaded in Portugal in 1441, and the explorer Christopher Columbus, born in Genoa 10 years later, were closely linked. The ensuing age of discovery, with its expansion of empires, exploitation of the New World natural resources, was accompanied by a seizure of forced labor of human beings, starting with the Native Americans, appraising that commercial opportunity came naturally to an entrepreneur like Columbus, as did his sponsors. Pressure on him to find precious metals and its religious contradictory concerns, both to protect and convert heathens. On the day after Columbus landed in 1492 on an island in the present-day Bahamas and saw its Taino islanders, he wrote, "With 50 men they could all be subjugated and made to do all that one wished." Columbus liked the affectionate and without malice I have no idea. Arakian natives. He found the men tall, handsome, and good farmers, and the women, etc., etc. This is basically what we see about the idea of taking control of areas and using the natural labor sources to exploit the Native American genocide and Holocaust. Germany again confronts its past. The U.S. Can't look in the mirror of history. Once again, this is from 5 months ago. Germany steps forward to confront. Germany again steps forward to confront and compensate for historical crimes. This time it's colonial genocide in Africa. Germany began a process of national self-criticism after World War II. That's not really the case. They didn't begin the examination until youth in about 1965 with the arrest and trial of Adolf Eichmann. Did Germany begin to experience a massive resistance by German youth asking their fathers and grandfathers what they had done in the genocide against Jews in World War II. The invasion of Germany, the invasion of Russia, the mass killings of Jews in both of those nations, the establishment of extermination camps throughout Poland and Germany, the initiation of slave labor, all meet the definitions of genocide. In fact, the U.S. government has done more to acknowledge its role in other countries' genocides than to acknowledge Native American genocide. For example, when Brazil formed a National Truth Commission to investigate repression of state security forces between 1964 and 1985, the U.S. agreed to a special declassification project to protect Brazil, identifying, centralizing, and reviewing hundreds of still secret CIA, defense, and department records from the 1960s, 70s, when the U.S. agencies assisted Brazil's state terror. President Obama signed a so-called apology to American Indians in a statement buried in the Defense Appropriations Act. Maybe that was appropriate given that the defense budget was tapped for many years to carry out the Native American genocide, to kill Native peoples and confine them to reservations, which the Nazis cited as precedent for their camps. Obama's signing of the ceremony was closed to the press. The results was more an effort to bury the past than to confront the possibility of compensation was not even disclosed. So, oddly enough, the restriction of the word Holocaust to a single historical event threatens to undermine the intention of the museum to prevent genocide, because the further back in history that single event recedes, the less significance it will have for future generations. The best thing the museum could do to educate citizens and leaders worldwide would be to refuse to see the Holocaust as a unique historical event. Jews throughout the world seem to feel that they were the only ones subject to a genocide, the only ones subject to a Holocaust. In the reality is Holocausts have taken place and genocides continue to take place worldwide. And there is one, this is our thesis today, there is one being prepared in the United States again against Americans. Let's get a look at the conspiracy theories now. Conspiracy theories in reference to what happened in 9/11. Why are we changing the theme between genocide and conspiracy theories? We'll be able to show a link between the two. The idea that a political action can be implemented to galvanize a people towards a political act, towards an opinion, to galvanize public opinion for a particular political act, an unwished war, hatred against individuals or against a group, is a typical way for demagogues, not only demagogues generally, but presidents of the United States specifically, to galvanize members of the public towards a particular way of thinking about minorities or a particular group, religious, ethnic, social, economic, and to galvanize the public opinion to take action against that group. Let's get a look again at the conspiracy theories and how they interact with the concept of genocide. The 9/11 theories are conspiracy theories. The 9/11 conspiracy theories are conspiracy theories that attribute the planning and execution of September 11 attacks against the United States to parties other than or in addition to Al-Qaeda, including that there was advanced knowledge of the attacks among high-level government officials. Government investigators and independent reviews have found no evidence for this theory. Proponents of these theories claim there are inconsistencies in the official conclusions or evidence that was either ignored or overlooked. The nature of the collapse of the World Trade Center towers and the nearby WTC-7. In this photo, the brown building on the left of the towers, that is this building right here, is a major focus of the 9/11 conspiracy theories. The most prominent conspiracy theories is that of the collapse of the Twin Towers and the World Trade Center, which was the result of controlled demolition rather than structural failure. This, I don't know what they are going to show in reference to controlled demolition. We are looking to find whether or not controlled definition actually is shown. We find this to be particularly of particular import. I don't know whether or not it will actually be shown. Apparently not. No. So this is not shown. So this is the example of what was left of the World Trade Center. That WT7 building is this one right here. So the question basically in this crisis is, how is it that this building was destroyed as well when the post office exactly behind one of the buildings, or Verizon directly next to the World Trade Center, received apparently very little damage at all. This building, World Trade Center, was completely destroyed. So the question about the World Trade Center controlled demolition theories contend that the collapse of the World Trade Center was not solely caused by the airliner crash damage that occurred as part of September 11th attacks and the resulting fire damage, but by explosives installed in the building in advance. Controlled demolition theories make up a major component of the 9/11 conspiracy theories. Early advocates such as physicist Jones, architect Richard Gage, software engineer Jim Hoffman, theologian David Ray Griffin argued that the aircraft impacts and resulting fires could not have weakened the building sufficiently to initiate the catastrophic collapse. Again, not sure whether or not catastrophic collapse, structural integrity. There are a lot of articles in Wikipedia about this. Collapsed barn. There may be some examples basically about the collapse of structures. But unfortunately, there is no replaying of the failure of the 9/11 Twin Towers. We will continue now with our idea about genocide and about how it came about. Genocides in the history of the United States. Again, the reason for this examination is clear. We believe that a genocide is being prepared in the United States against a people, against the poor and working poor, the blue-collar workers in America and their families, through the Republican Party and the elimination of health care in their health care bill. And the reason why this meets the criteria of a genocide, it meets the criteria of 2017, as it does in various other criteria since the 1970s. We will read now from a Wikipedia article, Genocides in History. Genocide is a deliberate and systematic destruction in whole or part of an ethnic, racial, social, or national group. The term was coined in 1944. There are genocides throughout the history of the world, genocides or other mass murders. World War I before 1490, 1490 to 1944. Kurdish genocide, above on the left-hand side. Pogroms, Nazi crimes against Soviet POWs. The Serbian genocide, 1971 Bangladesh genocide, the East Timor genocide, Cambodian genocide, Guatemalan genocide, Kurdish genocide, Iraq genocide, Rwanda genocide, Bosnian genocide, Srebrenica massacre, the Khmer Rouge genocide, extermination camps, genocide, effects of genocide and mass killings under communist regimes, anti-communist mass killings, compilation, alternative genocides, etc., etc. In the Americas, in Argentina, in Canada, in Hawaii, in Mexico, in Newfoundland, in Peru, in the United States, genocides have taken place. In Asia, in Afghanistan, in Jungar genocide, Japanese colonization of Hokkaido, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, Siberia, Vietnam, Europe, France, Ireland, the War of Three Kingdoms, the British Empire, the Great Irish Famine, Occitania, Oceania, Australia, New Zealand. In the 20th century, World War I. World War I and World War II both qualify as genocides having taken place. The Ottoman Empire, the Armenians, the Assyrians, the Greeks, the Maronite Christians, the Kurds, the Kingdom of Iraq, Russian Empire and Soviet Union, Tsarist Russia, Jews in Russia, Muslims in the Russian, Soviet Union, de-Kazakhization, the Poles in the Soviet Union, Chechnya, deportation of Baltic people, Crimea, Japan, Dominican Republic, Republic of China and Tibet, Germany and the Nazi-occupied Europe, the Holocaust, non-Jewish victims, Slavic population, Croatia, Poland, Romania, World War II, Central and Eastern Europe, ethnic cleansing of Germans, partition of India, Cambodia, Algeria, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Guatemala, India, Bangladesh, Burundi, North Korea, Indonesia's killing in 1965-1966, West Guinea, West Papua, East Timor, Bangladesh, the genocide of Kurds, Argentina, Ethiopia, Marsh Arabs, Brazil, Dominican Republic, Somalia, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Rwanda, Cambodia, International Criminal Court, see also notes, etc. Alternative definitions. What we see here, what we have just gone through as far as the definition or the examples in Wikipedia for the various numbers of genocides, mass killings, the criteria has been met time and time again in history. Rarely in history is a killing, is a mass genocide or extermination of a people indicated, publicly denounced, and then operatively worked against by the international community to prohibit the genocide. The reason for that is that the political, economic, and social power brought by groups initiating the genocide usually is such that it is difficult politically or militarily to interact, to intercede in the commitment of a genocide by a government. The United States, however, has time and time again called for the cessation of genocide against some real or ostensible party, and frequently in our history, in the history of the United States, has initiated direct military action, an invasion of a country, ostensibly to prohibit further killings of civilians in a political prepared genocide against a population, a defenseless civilian population. What we see here is the criteria for what we plan to look at in the last 20 minutes of our program today. We are looking at a Wikipedia article about a book which came about in the late 1980s by Randy Schultz of the San Francisco Chronicle. The book chronicles the discovery and spread of the human immunodeficiency virus, with a special emphasis on government indifference and political infighting, specifically in the United States, to what was then perceived as a specifically gay disease. Schultz's premise is that AIDS was allowed to happen while the disease is caused by a biological agent, incompetence and apathy towards those initially affected allowed its spread to become much worse. The name of the book, a bestseller at the time by Schultz, is And the Band Played On. The book is an extensive work of investigative journalism written in the form of as an encompassing timeline. The events that shaped the epidemic are prepared as sequential matter-of-fact summaries. Schultz describes the impact of the politics involved in battling the disease on particular individuals in the gay, medical, and political communities. Again, repeated, in the gay, medical, and political communities. This is important because the targeting of the communities is a criteria which meets the definition of genocide. And the numbers, we will see, meet that requirement as well. With the first confined case of AIDS, that of Gerthe Rask, a Danish doctor working in Africa, he ends with the announcement by actor Rock Hudson in 1985 that he was dying of AIDS when international attention on the disease exploded. And the Band Played On, the name of the book, the bestseller by Shields. And the Band Played On was critically acclaimed and became a bestseller. Judith Iannario of the Library Journal called it one of the most important books of the year upon its release. It made Schultz both a star and a pariah for his coverage of the disease and the bitter politics in the gay community. He described his motivation to undertake the writing of the book in an interview after its release, saying any good reporter could have done this story, but I think the reason I did it and no one else did is because I am gay. Schultz said that. It was happening to people I cared about and loved. The book was later adopted into an HBO film of the same name. Schultz was tested for HIV while he was writing the book. He died of complication of AIDS in 1994. Schultz decided to write And the Band Played On after attending an awards ceremony in 1983 where he was to receive a commendation for his coverage of AIDS. As described in the book, television announcer Bill Curtis gave the keynote address and told his joke, "What's the hardest part about having AIDS?" Trying to convince your wife you're Haitian. Schultz responded to the joke by saying that it says everything about how the media had dealt with AIDS. Bill Curtis felt that he could go in front of a journalist group in San Francisco and make AIDS jokes. First of all, he could assume that nobody there would be gay. If they were gay, they wouldn't talk about it, and that nobody would take offense at that. To me, that summed up the whole problem of dealing with AIDS in the media. Obviously, the reason I covered AIDS from the start was that, to me, it was never something that happened to those other people. Thank you. With this summary of And the Band Played On by Schultz, a incredibly good scenario about the development of the epidemic in the United States between the years of about 1981 to 1985. The crisis is clear. the medical community and the political community around Ronald Reagan refused to look at the reality of what was happening in this epidemic. It was clear that it was an epidemic. It was clear that those who were suffering from the disease were minorities. They were almost always men. They were almost always either homosexuals or those using drugs intravenously. So it was clear that there was a connection socially, politically, to minority groups, those drug addicted and homosexuals. The reality and the horror of this situation can be seen clearly. There was no coordinated effort under the Reagan administration. It became clear that Reagan, Health and Human Services, that Reagan was addressed by individuals from Health and Human Services, by the CDC, and others about this, but no coordinated effort to investigate, to come up with a scenario, a method of getting at the root cause and of the those dying in the epidemic. The reality was that needlessly over 41,000 people, men, Americans, for the vast majority, died. This meets the criteria that we have seen with the genocide definitions. Genocide is the attempt to destroy any recognized, stable, and permanent group as it is defined by the perpetrator. It is a concealed effort to eliminate its individual members and to destroy the group's ability to maintain its social, political, cultural cohesion, and thus its existence as a group. The social and cultural cohesion is precisely the element we're speaking about here. It is a concerted effort to eliminate its individual members and to destroy the group's ability to maintain its social and cultural cohesion, and thus its existence as a group. The perpetrator's genocidal goals, i.e. its intent, which is central to the 1948 UN definition, but is often analyzed too legalistically and narrowly, can be uncovered by examining policies, actions, and outcomes. So what we have here, beyond any shadow of a doubt, from the Reagan administration, every 4 years, Republican Ronald Reagan, the Republican Party dusts off its collection of Ronald Reagan political porn. They expect us to sit quietly by their candidates as they, every 4 years, let me read this again, every 4 years, the Republican Party dusts off its collection of Ronald Reagan political porn. They expect us to sit quietly by as their candidates take to the stump and frantically pleasure themselves in front of America, all in an effort to prove that they are the most like good old Ronnie. If they don't make the comparison themselves, there's no shortage of supporters who are willing to try to do that for them. While it's true that Ronald Reagan's election in 1980, you can find this, Ronald Reagan's election in 1980 and his re-election in 1984 were both landslides of epic proportions. It's also true that the Reagan administration is the most corrupt in the history of American presidency. Michael Moore summarizes the disastrous Reagan administration in 4 short minutes in his Capitalism, a Love Story film. So we see that the Republican Party and Ronald Reagan are linked. During his tenure in office, an unprecedented 138 administrative officials were investigated, indicted, or convicted of crimes. So that's what you can see. However, as a gay man, all of that pales in comparison to Ronald Reagan and his administration's shameful and callous indifference and disgraceful inaction in the early days of the AIDS crisis. Let's get a look at this tape.
During the 1980s, the spread of the AIDS epidemic went unchallenged by the United States government. Many Americans, including my mother, believe that the Reagan administration deliberately refused to address the issue. They believe inaction helped facilitate the development of AIDS in America. Many people in Reagan's socially conservative base supported the epidemic, claiming AIDS to be a punishment for social immorality. This outraged many, including my mother, who was struggling to define herself as a lesbian in a society that opposed her existence. Ronald Reagan was inaugurated President of the United States on January 20th, 1981. On June 5th, less than 5 months later, the Center for Disease Control, CDC, documented a mysterious immune system disorder affecting 5 homosexual men in Los Angeles. The CDC became alarmed due to mounting data supporting the development of a new virus epidemic. By the end of 1981, a total of 422 cases were reported, 159 of which had resulted in death. AIDS had begun to claim American lives and establish itself as a disease of the gay community. Despite the rising death toll, the Reagan administration made no effort to combat or even acknowledge the threat to the nation. My mother, a 24-year-old, found herself struggling to express her homosexual identity in a hostile culture of intolerance. Homosexuality was condemned as immoral by most of the nation. The gay community received very little legal protection from discrimination and violence. My mother, a new member of the gay community, watched as hatred and fear increased. She recalls feeling repressed and unable to express her identity as a lesbian openly, as well as the fear of the developing epidemic. With no help provided, it became apparent that the gay community would need to lead awareness efforts combating the transmission of the deadly virus. In 1982, the Gay Men's Health Crisis, GMHC, was formed in an attempt to counteract the spread of the disease. Despite their efforts, AIDS transmission continued to rise. The discovery that AIDS could be passed heterosexually from male to female later that year did nothing to sway public opinion of AIDS as a disease synonymous with homosexual men. The United States government continued to ignore the looming threat of AIDS. By May of 1983, French scientist Luc Monstrainer and his team in Paris discovered the possible connection between HIV and AIDS, which was confirmed by American Robert Gallo and his team a year later. After these breakthrough discoveries, the goal of scientists became learning how to neutralize the virus. Despite clear data from the CDC showing AIDS as a bloodborne pathogen, the Federal Drug Administration, FDA, did not approve AIDS antibody tests until 1985. By the end of that year, 22,996 cases of AIDS had been diagnosed in the US, and 12,592 had resulted in death, including Reagan's personal friend, actor Rock Hudson. The AIDS epidemic reached an unprecedented level. The outrage of Americans, particularly in the gay community, could no longer be silenced. Many in the conservative right viewed the virus as a form of retribution for homosexual people's immoral behavior. This deeply angered and offended my mother, who had a very strong personal reaction to this hatred. The reality that others in her own nation wished disease and death upon herself and those like her, solely based on their sexual orientation, horrified her. The Reagan administration's handling of the AIDS epidemic represented to my mother the nation's opinion of homosexuals as inferior second-class citizens. AIDS had swept the nation, and the government could no longer operate with inaction. The Reagan administration, finally acknowledging the epidemic as a serious threat to the nation, continued to be extremely limited in its efforts to prevent AIDS. The long process of combating the damage done by years of doing nothing had begun. In 1985, U.S. blood banks introduced blood screening tests, reducing the risk of AIDS transmission from tainted blood. Simultaneously, the FDA began testing for antibodies to HIV. The death toll continued to rise, along with national outrage. Reagan finally gave his first national address on AIDS in 1987, 5 years after the virus was named, 3 years after its official discovery. Reagan finally used the word AIDS in public. By the end of that year, an estimated 36,000 Americans had been diagnosed with AIDS, and 20,000 had died. The AIDS Memorial Quilt was started. This is the place where my parents found my name.
This was a very moving definition and indictment against the Reagan administration. We thank the producers of the program for this very interesting and accurate description of how the political establishment refused to recognize the crisis. We read again from the definitions, the two definitions on your screen of genocide. Genocide is when a collective source of power, usually a state, intentionally uses its power base to implement a process of destruction in order to destroy a group, as defined by the perpetrator, in whole or in substantial part dependent upon relative group size. And John Cox, historian, genocide is the attempt to destroy any recognized, stable, and permanent group as it is defined by the perpetrator. It is a concerted effort to eliminate its individual members and to destroy the group's ability to maintain its social cultural cohesion and thus its existence of a group. This is interesting to us here at What We Should Know for the following reason. We believe that the poor and working poor, as defined by political candidates, progressive political candidates, including representatives here in the state of Massachusetts, Mike Connolly, but also Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, recognizing that the poor and working poor constitute a political group, a political class, and that this group is economically, socially, and apparently now politically deprived in an administration who purposefully works to eliminate budgets, to consolidate power, to consolidate financial structures through a budget, establishing a budget which favors the wealthy, the extreme wealth, the elimination of tax structures, the adding of tax incentives for the very rich, and the crisis that we have with the healthcare destruction by the Republican Party, similar to what Reagan did in his disregard for the crisis, and which suffices the criteria of a genocide because it was against a social group and attempted through its policies to eliminate the social cohesion and the destruction of that group. We believe here at What We Should Know that a similar policy is being developed now by the Republican Party in an effort to destroy the poor and the working poor. The estimates are that if the Obama healthcare bill is destroyed completely and replaced by the position taken by the Republican Party, that the crisis and the consequence of this American Health Care Act will be the death of thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, perhaps many more individuals within a decade of the implementation of that act. That in itself qualifies as a genocide because it's enacted by a political party and intends to have negative consequences against a established social group. The social group is the poor and working poor. It is the blue collar. It is the poorly educated or not adequately educated individuals within the United States. This program today is an attempt to critically examine the potential going forward of the Republican Party to create a genocide within the United States. We've seen today that other genocides have been created on the American continent, hundreds of them, if one examines both Canada and South America. We call upon the Republican Party to repeal their intentions.